Welcome back. Tonight, I'd like you to imagine standing inside a quiet workshop in a newly captured city. No cheering crowds, no banners raised above the walls, just the steady rhythm of metal against metal. The year is 1326. History remembers this period for sieges and expansion, for the slow rise of a frontier principality. But when you look closely, something far more decisive was happening away from the battlefield. In this episode, we'll step into that quieter moment and explore how the striking of a small silver coin signaled the transformation of a warband into a state. The establishment of the first Ottoman mint wasn't just about money. It was a quiet but decisive declaration of statehood. When the Ottomans began minting their own coins, most likely in Bursa after its capture in 1326, they crossed an invisible line that separated a frontier beylik from a sovereign polity. Coinage, in the medieval Islamic world, was one of the clearest signs of legitimate rule. To strike coins in your own name meant you no longer acknowledged another authority above you, not the Seljuks, not the Ilkhanids, not Byzantium. Under Orhan, the first silver axe appeared, simple, restrained, and almost austere. No elaborate imagery, no imperial boast, just inscriptions affirming authority, faith, and continuity. This restraint mattered. It reflected a political culture that valued stability and recognition over spectacle. The Ottomans were not announcing an empire, they were normalizing rule. What makes the first Ottoman mint especially significant is timing. Militarily, the Ottomans were still one power among many in Anatolia. Administratively, their institutions were still forming. Yet monetarily, they acted with confidence. Coinage unified markets, standardized taxation, paid soldiers, and quietly stitched together conquered lands into a single economic space. Long before imperial titles or grand architecture, money did the work of empire. In that sense, the first Ottoman mint was less a symbol of ambition and more a signal of inevitability. States that last tend to institutionalize early and boast later. The Ottomans did exactly that, and the axe, modest as it looked, became the pulse of a polity that would endure for centuries. Imagine a small silver coin resting in the palm of your hand. It is thin, slightly uneven, and worn smooth by centuries of use. The edges are not perfectly round, and the surface bears faint marks left by the hands of merchants, soldiers, and travelers who once carried it across markets and roads long forgotten. Across the face of the coin runs a delicate line of Arabic script. Time has softened the letters, but they are still visible, carefully engraved, then struck into silver by a craftsman who lived more than 700 years ago. To us, it might appear ordinary. Just a coin, a piece of money from a distant past. But in the medieval world, coins were never just money. They carried meaning. They carried authority. And above all, they carried names. The name on this coin belongs to a ruler from a time when the Ottoman Empire did not yet exist. There was no vast empire stretching across continents, no imperial capital commanding distant provinces, no powerful sultans ruling over millions. Instead, there was only a small principality forming along the frontier of northwestern Anatolia, a place where the borders between worlds were uncertain. To the west lay the lands of the Byzantine Empire. Once the dominant power of the eastern Mediterranean, Byzantium still controlled important cities and fortresses, though its strength was slowly fading. To the east and south were other Turkish principalities, small states ruled by ambitious leaders who competed constantly for land and influence. And across much of Anatolia lingered the shadow of the Mongol world, whose armies had reshaped the political landscape only decades earlier. This was not a stable region. It was a frontier, a place where power shifted quickly, where alliances formed and collapsed, where small states could rise suddenly and disappear just as quickly. Among the many leaders navigating this uncertain world was a frontier ruler named Osman. His domain was modest, a cluster of settlements and newly conquered lands gathered around the borderlands between Byzantine and Turkish territories. The people who followed him were not the citizens of an empire. They were frontier settlers, warriors seeking opportunity, families escaping instability, craftsmen, traders, and religious figures drawn to a place where fortunes could still be made. Together, they formed a small but growing community. At first, their strength came from movement, from raids into neighboring territories, from capturing villages and fortresses along the frontier. Success brought new followers, and with every victory, Osman's domain slowly expanded. But conquest alone does not create a state. Holding territory requires something different. It requires organization, administration, systems that allow power to move beyond the battlefield. As the frontier settlements grew into towns and markets, new challenges began to emerge. Merchants needed reliable ways to exchange goods. Taxes had to be collected. Soldiers had to be paid. Trade flowed through the region in complex network that stretched far beyond the frontier itself. Caravans moved between cities carrying textiles, metals, grain, and spices. Markets connected villages with larger urban centers. And every transaction required one simple but essential tool: money. Yet the lands controlled by the early Ottomans did not yet possess their own currency. Instead, a mixture of coins circulated through the region. Byzantine coins, coins from older Turkish states, various currencies carried by traders from distant lands. This diversity reflected the complicated political geography of Anatolia. But it also revealed something else. The Ottomans at this stage were still part of a broader system shaped by other powers. They had not yet fully defined their own authority. In the medieval world, the ability to mint coins was more than a practical tool of commerce. It was a symbol of sovereignty. Across the Islamic world, rulers demonstrated their legitimacy through two important acts. The first was the public sermon, or khutbah, in which the ruler's name was proclaimed during Friday prayers. The second was the minting of coins bearing the ruler's name. Together, these acts signaled that a political leader possessed true authority. They transformed military power into recognized rule. Coins played a particularly powerful role in this process. Because coins traveled, they passed through the hands of merchants, soldiers, farmers, and craftsmen. They moved across towns and villages, across roads, markets, and caravan routes. Every exchange carried the ruler's name further. Every purchase quietly repeated the same message: this land is ruled by this authority. For a small frontier principality trying to establish itself in a competitive region, that message mattered greatly. It was not enough to win battles. Power needed to be seen, recognized, accepted. And so, sometime during the early decades of Ottoman expansion, the decision was made to create a mint, a place where metal could be shaped into currency, where the name of the ruler could be engraved into silver, where the authority of a frontier leader could be struck into coins that would circulate far beyond the walls of any single city. The process itself was not dramatic. There were no armies gathering, no proclamations echoing through great halls. Instead, craftsmen prepared small metal blanks. Dies were engraved with careful inscriptions, and with each strike of the hammer, a new coin was created. Yet behind that quiet work stood something larger. Because with every coin produced, the Ottomans were making a statement. They were declaring that their authority was no longer temporary, no longer simply the power of a successful frontier warrior. Instead, they were presenting themselves as rulers whose authority could regulate trade, collect taxes, and govern land. It was a small step, but history often moves through small steps. What began as a modest frontier principality would eventually grow into one of the longest-lasting empires in world history. And yet, if we look closely at the beginning of that transformation, we do not see great palaces or vast armies. We see something much simpler: a small piece of silver, a coin, worn by centuries, and carrying the name of a ruler whose power was only just beginning to take shape. Long before the Ottomans appeared on the stage of history, rulers had understood something simple but powerful. Control over money meant control over authority. In the ancient and medieval worlds, the right to produce coins was never an ordinary privilege. It belonged to kings, emperors, and sovereign rulers. It was a mark of legitimacy, one that signaled to subjects and rivals alike that a political power had the authority to govern land, regulate markets, and impose order. A coin was not simply metal. It was a political statement. Every inscription engraved into its surface carried a message about who ruled and whose authority shaped the world in which people lived. In the Roman Empire, emperors placed their portraits on coins that circulated across thousands of miles. From the markets of Rome to distant provinces, these coins reminded people of the ruler whose authority held the empire together. In the Islamic world, the tradition developed differently. Rather than portraits, coins carried inscriptions, carefully written lines of Arabic script that proclaimed the name of the ruler and often invoked divine authority. These inscriptions were not decorative. They were deliberate. Each coin announced who possessed the right to rule. For centuries, Islamic political tradition linked two acts closely with sovereignty. The first was the khutbah, the public sermon delivered during Friday prayers in the mosque. When a ruler's name was spoken in this sermon, it signaled that his authority was recognized over that territory. The second was the minting of coins. When a ruler struck coins bearing his name, he was declaring that his authority extended into the economic life of the land. Together, these acts transformed power into legitimacy. They turned military strength into recognized rule. This connection between coinage and sovereignty was widely understood across the medieval world. Merchants understood it. Officials understood it, and rival rulers understood it as well. When a new coin appeared in circulation, bearing the name of a previously unknown ruler, it sent a clear signal. A new political power had emerged. In many cases, the appearance of new coinage marked the moment when a local leader began asserting independence from a larger authority. Throughout Anatolia, this pattern had repeated many times. During the centuries before the Ottomans, the region had been shaped by powerful states and empires. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum had once ruled much of central Anatolia, minting coins that circulated through cities and trade routes across the region. But by the late 13th century, the Seljuk state had weakened dramatically. Mongol invasions had shattered its political unity. Local governors and frontier commanders began acting increasingly on their own authority. Out of this fragmented landscape emerged a number of smaller states, known as beyliks, each ruled by a local leader known as a bey. These beyliks competed with one another for territory and influence. Some controlled prosperous cities. Others dominated key trade routes. Many maintained uneasy relationships with the Mongol Ilkhanate, which still exerted influence over much of Anatolia. Within this environment, the question of legitimacy was always present. A local leader might command warriors and capture territory, but that alone did not guarantee lasting authority. To transform military success into stable rule required symbols and institutions. Coinage was one of the most powerful of those symbols. When a beylik minted coins in the name of its ruler, It signaled that the state had begun to see itself as something more permanent. It was no longer simply a military coalition or temporary frontier power. It was claiming the authority of a state. For the Ottomans, this step carried particular significance. Their early rise took place along the Byzantine frontier in northwestern Anatolia, a region where political authority had become fluid and uncertain. Byzantine control had weakened in many rural areas. Frontier fortresses stood isolated. Local populations often shifted their loyalties depending on who could provide protection and stability. In this environment, ambitious leaders had opportunities to expand their influence. But expansion alone did not guarantee permanence. Many frontier warlords rose quickly, only to fade from history within a generation. The Ottomans themselves began as one such frontier power. Under Osman and later his son Orhan, their followers gradually captured villages, towns, and fortifications along the borderlands. These victories brought land and resources, but they also brought responsibility. As the territory under Ottoman control expanded, the leadership of the principality faced new challenges. They had to organize taxation. They had to support growing urban populations. They had to maintain loyalty among diverse groups of settlers and warriors. And they had to ensure that trade and markets could function within their lands. All of this required a stable economic system. Markets depended on trusted currency. Merchants needed reliable money that could be accepted in transactions across different regions. Without it, trade slowed and economic life became uncertain. At first, the Ottomans relied on existing currencies. Coins minted by Byzantines, Seljuks, and other states circulated through the markets of their territory. But this situation carried an implicit message. It meant that the economic life of the region still depended on currencies issued by other powers. As long as foreign coins dominated the markets, the Ottomans remained connected to a system shaped by external authorities. Creating their own coinage would change that. It would place the Ottoman ruler's name directly into the daily economic exchanges of the region. Every purchase in a market, every tax payment, every commercial transaction, each one would repeat the same message. This land operates under the authority of this ruler. For a frontier principality seeking to establish itself among powerful neighbors, that message mattered deeply. Because sovereignty in the medieval world was not only enforced through armies, it was reinforced through symbols, through institutions, through the quiet repetition of authority in everyday life. And few symbols carried that authority more effectively than a coin, small enough to pass unnoticed from hand to hand, yet powerful enough to carry the name of a ruler across an entire region. In time, the Ottomans would come to mint enormous quantities of coinage, supporting an empire whose economy stretched across continents. But at the beginning of that long story, the act of striking silver carried a different meaning. It was a declaration, a signal that a frontier power was beginning to see itself as something more. A power no longer defined solely by conquest, but by the institutions of rule. And among those institutions, one of the most enduring was the mint, where metal could be shaped into money, and authority could be struck into silver. In the late 13th century, the lands of northwestern Anatolia stood at the meeting point of two worlds. To the west lay the Byzantine Empire, heir to centuries of Roman tradition. Its great cities still held impressive walls and churches, and its rulers in Constantinople continued to claim authority over vast territories. Yet the empire was no longer the dominant force it had once been. Decades of internal struggles, economic strain, and external pressure had weakened its control over many frontier regions. Beyond the fortified cities and major roads, Byzantine authority often faded into uncertainty. To the east, a different political landscape had taken shape. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had once ruled much of Anatolia, had been shattered by the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. What remained was a patchwork of smaller states ruled by local leaders, ambitious warlords, frontier commanders, and tribal chiefs who had carved out territories of their own. These new principalities were known as beyliks. Each beylik was centered around a leader called a bey, a ruler whose authority rested on personal loyalty, military success, and the ability to attract followers. Some beyliks controlled important cities and trade routes. Others ruled smaller frontier regions where borders were constantly shifting. Among these frontier states was a small principality that would later be known as the Ottoman Beylik. At the time, however, it was only one among many. Its leader, Osman, governed a modest territory near the Byzantine frontier. His lands lay in a region of hills, valleys, and fertile plains that had long served as a border zone between competing powers. Life on this frontier was different from life in the great imperial cities. Here stability was rare. Fortresses changed hands. Villages sometimes paid taxes to one ruler one year and another ruler the next. Local populations adapted to whichever authority could provide protection and order. In this environment, political power depended heavily on mobility and strength. Frontier leaders gathered bands of warriors who rode across the borderlands raiding enemy territory, capturing fortifications, and claiming new lands. These warriors were often described in later sources as ghazis, fighters who saw their campaigns as both military ventures and acts of religious struggle along the frontier between Christian and Muslim worlds. Whether motivated by faith, opportunity, or both, many men were drawn to the frontier. Victory brought rewards: land, wealth, prestige. Successful leaders attracted more followers, and with more followers came the ability to launch larger campaigns. This cycle of expansion helped certain frontier rulers grow rapidly in influence. Osman was one of them. Over time, his small principality began to expand into nearby Byzantine territory. Villages and fortresses were captured, sometimes through battle and sometimes through negotiation or alliance. Each new settlement added people, resources, and strategic advantages. But conquest alone did not guarantee stability. Frontier warfare could create opportunity, but it could also produce chaos. Leaders who wished to hold territory for the long term had to do more than win battles. They had to govern. As Osman's principality grew, its character slowly began to change. What had begun as a loose coalition of warriors and settlers gradually developed into something more structured. New towns formed around captured fortresses. Markets emerged where farmers and traders exchanged goods. Artisans and craftsmen settled in growing communities. Religious scholars and judges appeared, helping organize legal and social life. The frontier was no longer just a place of raids and skirmishes. It was becoming a place of settlement. This transformation brought new responsibilities for the leadership of the Ottoman Principality. Warriors needed to be rewarded with land or income. Local populations required administration and justice. Trade had to be protected and regulated. Taxes needed to be collected in ways that sustained the growing state without provoking unrest. These were the challenges of governance. And governance required more than military strength. It required institutions, structures that could organize society beyond the battlefield. Many of these institutions developed gradually. Sometimes they evolved naturally as communities expanded. Other times they were adopted from older traditions that had long existed in the region. Anatolia had been shaped by centuries of Byzantine, Seljuk, and Islamic political systems. Frontier rulers often borrowed ideas and practices from these traditions as they built their own administrations. The Ottomans were no exception. Their state did not emerge fully formed. Instead, it developed step by step as their territory expanded and their responsibilities increased. Cities played an especially important role in this transformation. While rural villages formed the backbone of agricultural life, cities were centers of trade, craftsmanship, and administration. Control of a city meant access to resources, skilled populations, and economic networks that stretched far beyond local borders. For the Ottomans, gaining influence over urban centers marked an important stage in their rise. Urban life brought markets filled with merchants and goods from distant lands. Caravans passed through carrying textiles, spices, metals, and other valuable commodities. Taxes collected from trade could provide steady revenue for the ruling authority. But urban economies also depended on stability. Merchants needed reliable systems of exchange. Markets functioned best when money was widely accepted and trusted. In regions where multiple currencies circulated, transactions could become complicated. Coins minted by different states often varied in weight, metal content, and value. Traders had to constantly assess the reliability of the money they received. In this environment, political authority and economic stability were closely connected. Rulers who could provide reliable institutions, including trusted coinage, gained advantages over their rivals. For a frontier principality seeking to transform itself into a lasting state, these economic foundations were essential. The early Ottoman leadership understood that controlling land was only part of the challenge. To sustain their growing power, they needed systems that allowed trade, taxation, and administration to function smoothly. These systems would gradually take shape over the coming decades. Among them would be courts, administrative offices, and mechanisms for distributing land and income among loyal followers. But one institution would carry a special significance. An institution capable of placing the ruler's name into the everyday economic life of the region. An institution that could turn silver into both money and message. The mint. It would not appear overnight. Like many aspects of the early Ottoman state, it would emerge gradually as the principality expanded and its leadership gained confidence in their authority. But when the Ottomans eventually began striking their own coins, they would be taking a decisive step. A step that signaled their transformation from frontier warlords into rulers of a growing political state. And in the quiet workshops where those first coins were struck, the foundations of a future empire were beginning to take shape. At the beginning of the 14th century, the Ottoman Principality was still small. Its lands were scattered across the frontier zone between Byzantine territory and the emerging Turkish beyliks of Anatolia. Villages, hilltop fortresses, and narrow valleys formed the backbone of the young state. Control over these areas was often fragile, shaped as much by local alliances as by military power. Yet something was beginning to change. Under the leadership of Osman and later his son Orhan, the Ottoman domain slowly expanded. What had once been a modest frontier territory began to absorb nearby settlements and strategic strongholds. Each new conquest altered the balance of power in the region. Frontier villages that had once looked to Byzantine governors for protection now found themselves under Ottoman rule. Farmers, craftsmen, and merchants gradually adapted to the authority of new leaders. For many of these communities, the change was less dramatic than it might seem. Frontier populations were accustomed to shifting political control. What mattered most to them was stability. A ruler who could protect their land, maintain order, and allow trade to continue often earned loyalty regardless of cultural or religious differences. In this sense, the growth of the Ottoman Principality was not driven only by warfare. It was also shaped by practical governance. When the Ottomans captured a settlement, they did not simply plunder and move on. Instead, they often sought to integrate these communities into their growing domain. Local agricultural systems continued to function. Markets remained active. Existing populations were usually allowed to remain in their homes as long as they recognized the authority of the new rulers and paid the required taxes. This pragmatic approach helped the Ottomans consolidate control over newly acquired lands. But as their territory expanded, so too did the complexity of governing it. A small frontier band could operate through personal loyalty and informal arrangements. A growing principality required something more organized. New administrative challenges appeared almost immediately. Land had to be distributed among loyal warriors who had helped secure the territory. These grants were not simply rewards, they were also mechanisms of control. By tying military service to landholding, the leadership of the principality ensured that local authority remained connected to the central ruler. Taxes needed to be collected in ways that sustained the expanding state, while maintaining stability among the population. Justice had to be administered in disputes between communities and individuals. Infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and markets required oversight. These responsibilities marked an important transition in the character of the Ottoman state. The principality was no longer just a frontier coalition defined by raids and campaigns. It was beginning to function as a territorial government. Urban centers played a crucial role in this transformation. Villages could support agriculture, but cities generated economic activity on a much larger scale. Markets within towns connected local production with wider trade networks that stretched across Anatolia and beyond. For the Ottomans, gaining influence over towns meant gaining access to these economic systems. One of the most significant moments in this process came with the gradual Ottoman pressure on the Byzantine city of Bursa. Located in northwestern Anatolia near the slopes of Mount Uludag, Bursa was a prosperous urban center known for its markets and strategic position along important trade routes. For years, the city had served as a Byzantine stronghold in the region. But as Ottoman influence grew around it, Bursa increasingly found itself isolated. The surrounding countryside had begun to fall under Ottoman control. Supply routes became vulnerable. The balance of power in the region was shifting. Eventually, after years of pressure, the city would come under Ottoman authority. The capture of Bursa represented more than a military victory. It marked a turning point in the development of the Ottoman state. Unlike smaller frontier settlements, Bursa was a large and economically vibrant city. Governing such a place required administrative capacity far beyond what a simple warband could provide. Urban populations required structured governance. Merchants needed predictable systems of taxation. Markets demanded stable conditions in order to thrive. In short, ruling a city meant ruling a complex society. For the Ottomans, this challenge accelerated the process of institutional development. New administrative roles appeared. Legal authorities helped mediate disputes and maintain order. Tax systems became more organized as revenue from agriculture and trade flowed into the expanding state. These developments gradually transformed the character of the principality. While military expansion remained important, governance was becoming equally central to Ottoman success. The leadership of the state began to understand that long-term power required more than battlefield victories. It required structures that could sustain economic life and support the institutions of rule. Among the most important aspects of this emerging system was commerce. Trade had long been a defining feature of Anatolia. Caravan routes connected the region to cities across the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean. Goods flowed through these networks in remarkable variety. Silks and textiles, grain and livestock, metals and crafted tools, spices and luxury items carried across vast distances. Markets in Anatolian cities served as hubs where these goods were exchanged and redistributed. For merchants operating within this system, trust was essential. Transactions required currency that could be accepted by buyers and sellers alike. In regions where political authority was fragmented, this could become complicated. Different states minted their own coins, each with varying metal content and weight. Some coins were widely trusted. Others circulated only locally. Traders had to evaluate the reliability of the money they received in every exchange. Within the growing Ottoman territories, this situation presented a challenge. As long as the economy depended entirely on foreign coinage, Byzantine, Seljuk, or other regional currencies, the economic life of the principality remained partially tied to external authorities. Markets might function, but the Ottomans themselves did not yet fully control the monetary system that supported their own economy. For a rising state seeking independence and legitimacy, this limitation carried significance. Control over land and cities was one thing. Control over economic instruments was another. As the Ottoman leadership consolidated their growing territory, they began to recognize the importance of developing their own institutions. Institutions capable of supporting trade, taxation, and administration across an expanding domain. Among these institutions, one would prove especially powerful. A place where silver and gold could be transformed into currency. A place where the ruler's name could be engraved into metal and circulated throughout the land. The mint. When that moment arrived, it would represent more than a technical innovation. It would signal that the Ottoman state had begun to claim a deeper form of authority. An authority that reached not only across the battlefield, but also into the markets, towns, and daily exchanges of ordinary people. And with that step, the transformation of a frontier principality into a structured state would move one stage further. By the early 14th century, the lands controlled by the Ottomans were no longer just a zone of raids and shifting borders. Gradually, they were becoming something more stable. Villages cultivated fields that had been farmed for generations. Small towns held weekly markets where farmers brought grain, fruit, and livestock to sell. Craftsmen produced tools, textiles, and pottery for local use. Caravans traveling between larger cities occasionally passed through these frontier settlements, bringing goods from distant regions. Despite the political uncertainty that often surrounded frontier life, economic activity continued. Trade had always been one of the defining forces of Anatolia. For centuries, the region had served as a bridge between continents. Roads crossing its mountains and plains connected the Mediterranean world with Central Asia and the Middle East. Merchants traveled these routes carrying valuable cargo. Silk from the East, spices from distant markets, metals, ceramics, textiles, and countless other goods. Some merchants journeyed for weeks or months, stopping in cities and towns along the way to exchange their goods for profit. Others traded more locally, moving products between nearby communities. Markets formed the heart of this activity. In small villages, these markets might appear only once a week. Farmers arrived early in the morning, bringing baskets of produce or animals for sale. Traders laid out fabrics, tools, or household items on simple wooden tables. In larger towns, the markets were more permanent. Shops lined narrow streets, each devoted to a specific craft or trade. Bakers, blacksmiths, leatherworkers, and textile merchants all played a role in the local economy. These places were more than centers of commerce. They were gathering points where people exchanged news, formed relationships, and connected their communities to the wider world. For the Ottoman Principality, these markets represented an important source of prosperity. Economic stability strengthened political authority. A ruler who protected trade routes, maintained order in markets, and ensured fair taxation could attract merchants and craftsmen to his territory. And wherever merchants gathered, wealth followed. But economic life also depended on trust. Every exchange in the marketplace required agreement on value. When a farmer sold grain, he needed to trust that the coins he received would be accepted elsewhere. When a merchant purchased cloth or tools, he needed confidence that the currency used in the transaction held reliable worth. Without that trust, trade slowed. Markets became uncertain. Merchants hesitated to accept unfamiliar coins, whose weight or metal content might vary. In regions where many different currencies circulated, this problem became common. Anatolia in the 14th century was exactly such a place. Coins minted by several states moved through its markets. Byzantine coins were still widely used in cities that remained under imperial influence. Some older Seljuk coins continued to circulate as well, even though the Seljuk state itself had largely faded from power. Other Turkish beyliks minted their own currency, though the reach of these coins often remained limited to nearby regions. For merchants traveling between towns, this mixture of coinage could be confusing. A coin accepted in one market might be viewed with suspicion in another. Traders sometimes weighed coins carefully before accepting them. Others relied on experienced money changers who specialized in evaluating different currencies. This system allowed commerce to continue, but it also created inefficiencies. And for rulers seeking to consolidate their authority, it presented a deeper problem. If the economy of a territory relied primarily on foreign coins, the political authority behind those coins continued to shape economic life. Even if a ruler controlled the land itself, the daily exchange of goods might still depend on the currency of another state. For a frontier principality seeking independence and stability, this situation was far from ideal. The Ottoman leadership was beginning to understand that controlling territory was only one part of building a state. True authority required institutions that reached into everyday life. Law, administration, taxation, and eventually currency. When people used a ruler's coinage in their daily transactions, they participated in the economic system of that ruler's state. Each exchange reinforced the authority behind the coin. Every purchase quietly acknowledged the legitimacy of the power that produced it. For this reason, many medieval rulers invested great effort into maintaining their own monetary systems. Coins carried more than economic value. They carried political identity. They reminded people, often without them even realizing it, who governed the land. In the growing Ottoman territories, these ideas were beginning to take shape. Markets were expanding as new towns developed and trade increased. Merchants and craftsmen played an increasingly visible role in the local economy. Tax revenues collected from trade provided important resources for the state. Yet the monetary system supporting these markets remained fragmented. Coins from multiple states continued to circulate side by side. This arrangement worked for a time. But as the Ottoman Principality expanded and its institutions grew more organized, the need for a more unified economic structure became clear. A state that wished to sustain long-term growth required a currency it could regulate and control. Such a currency could simplify trade within its territory. It could strengthen taxation systems and it could project political authority into every corner of the market. The solution to this challenge lay in an institution that had served rulers for centuries. An institution where precious metal could be transformed into coins, carrying the name and authority of the ruler. A place where economic life and political legitimacy met. The mint. But before such an institution could exist, the Ottoman leadership needed confidence in their own authority. Minting coins was not a minor administrative act. It was a declaration to neighbors and rivals alike. A declaration that the ruler whose name appeared on the coin possessed the sovereignty to govern. For a young frontier state surrounded by powerful neighbors, making such a declaration required careful timing. Yet as the Ottoman territories continued to grow and their economic life expanded, that moment was approaching. Soon, the silver that passed through the markets of the frontier would begin to carry a new name. A name that would travel through villages, towns, and caravan routes. A name that would quietly announce the rise of a new power in Anatolia. For generations before the Ottomans began striking their own coins, the markets of Anatolia functioned with money issued by other powers. A merchant arriving in a frontier town might carry several types of coins in his pouch. Some were Byzantine, stamped with symbols from the long tradition of the Eastern Roman Empire. Others had been minted by earlier Turkish states that once ruled the region. A few might come from distant lands, carried along trade routes that stretched far beyond Anatolia itself. This mixture of currencies reflected the political complexity of the region. Empires rose and fell, borders shifted, and yet coins often continued circulating long after the states that produced them had weakened or disappeared. Silver held value regardless of the authority behind it. But for traders and officials, this diversity of coinage created constant uncertainty. Not every coin was equal. Some coins contained high-quality silver and were widely trusted. Others were lighter, worn down, or made from lower-quality metal. Over time, rulers sometimes reduced the amount of precious metal in their currency, hoping to stretch limited resources further. Such practices made it increasingly difficult to determine the real value of money in everyday transactions. Merchants learned to adapt. In busy markets, experienced money changers could often be found sitting at small tables surrounded by scales and weights. Their job was to evaluate the coins that passed through the market. They weighed each piece carefully, examined its markings, sometimes even cut into the metal to verify its composition. In return for a small fee, they would exchange unfamiliar coins for ones more widely accepted in the region. These money changers played an important role in keeping trade moving. But their presence also revealed the limits of the existing monetary system. If merchants needed specialists simply to verify currency, then the economic environment remained fragile. Trade could continue, but it required constant vigilance. For rulers trying to consolidate their authority, this situation posed a challenge. Taxes collected from markets might arrive in several different currencies. Payments to soldiers or officials could require complicated conversions. The economic life of the territory depended on systems that the ruler himself did not fully control. This was especially true in the early Ottoman territories. At first, Byzantine coins were still common in many frontier markets. Despite the weakening of Byzantine authority in rural regions, the empire's monetary system had existed for centuries, and its coins were widely recognized. Some Seljuk coins also remained in circulation, remnants of the once powerful Sultanate of Rum. And as new Turkish beyliks emerged across Anatolia, their currencies occasionally appeared in local trade as well. The result was a marketplace filled with overlapping monetary systems. For everyday buyers and sellers, this situation was manageable but inconvenient. For a rising state seeking long-term stability, it highlighted an important limitation. As long as economic exchange relied on the currencies of other states, the Ottomans remained partially dependent on those external systems. Their political authority might control land and cities, but their economic foundation rested on money issued elsewhere. This dependence carried symbolic implications as well. Coins carried the names of rulers. When Byzantine coins circulated in a market, they quietly reminded people of Byzantine authority, even in regions where that authority had weakened. The same was true for coins minted by other powers. Each transaction repeated the presence of those rulers within the daily life of the marketplace. For the Ottomans, establishing their own coinage would change that dynamic. It would allow their ruler's name to circulate throughout the region. Every exchange would reinforce the presence of Ottoman authority. Every tax payment made with Ottoman coins would strengthen the connection between the population and the state. Yet creating a new currency was not a simple decision. Minting coins required resources. Precious metals had to be obtained. Craftsmen skilled in engraving dies and striking coins needed to be employed. A system had to be developed to regulate production and ensure consistency in weight and quality. And perhaps most importantly, the ruler issuing the coins had to possess enough confidence in his authority to place his name into circulation. Because once a coin was minted, its message spread far beyond the walls of the mint. Merchants would carry it across trade routes. Travelers would bring it into distant towns. Rival rulers would eventually see it as well. Minting coins was therefore more than an economic act. It was a public declaration, a statement that the authority behind the coin considered itself sovereign. For small frontier states, making such a declaration too early could provoke unwanted attention. More powerful neighbors might interpret it as a challenge. Yet delaying the creation of coinage could also limit the growth of the state's institutions. The Ottoman leadership faced exactly this balance. Their power was growing. Their territory was expanding. Markets within their lands were becoming more active. But the moment when they would strike their own coins still required careful consideration. When that moment finally arrived, it would signal that the Ottoman Principality had crossed an important threshold. It would show that its rulers no longer saw themselves merely as frontier commanders operating within a wider political landscape. Instead, they were beginning to present themselves as sovereign authorities. Authorities whose names deserved to be engraved in silver. Authorities whose rule would be carried from hand to hand in the everyday exchanges of the marketplace. The markets of the frontier had long relied on the currency of others. Soon, a new coin would begin to circulate among them, and with it would come the quiet announcement of a new power rising in Anatolia. At some point in the early 14th century, the leadership of the Ottoman Principality faced a decision that went far beyond the practical needs of trade. Their territory was growing. Settlements that had once stood on uncertain frontier ground were now part of a larger and more stable domain. Markets were expanding, merchants were arriving, and the administrative responsibilities of the state were becoming more complex. The Ottoman rulers were no longer simply leading raids across the borderlands. They were governing. With that shift came new expectations. Rulers across the medieval world were judged not only by their ability to win battles, but also by their ability to organize the lands under their control. They were expected to maintain order, regulate trade, support religious institutions, and oversee systems of taxation and justice. In short, they were expected to rule like sovereigns. For the Ottomans, this transformation had occurred gradually. The early decades of their rise had been shaped by the leadership of Osman, the frontier lord whose name would later give the dynasty its identity. Under his guidance, the small principality had expanded steadily along the Byzantine frontier. After Osman's time, leadership passed to his son Orhan. Orhan inherited a territory that was larger and more complex than the one his father had once governed. Several important towns had come under Ottoman control, and the principality now possessed greater resources and a growing population. This expansion brought both opportunity and responsibility. The Ottoman state needed structures capable of supporting its new role. Markets required reliable systems of exchange. Taxation required clear procedures. Officials responsible for collecting revenue and administering justice needed tools that reflected the authority of the ruler they served. Among these tools, currency held special importance. For years, the markets of Ottoman territory had relied on coins issued by other states. This arrangement had allowed commerce to function, but it also reflected the early stage of Ottoman political development. A ruler whose lands depended entirely on foreign coinage had not yet fully established his own economic system. As the Ottoman leadership considered the future of their growing state, the advantages of minting their own coins became increasingly clear. A local currency would simplify trade within their territory. Merchants could conduct business using coins whose value and metal content were clearly understood. Tax payments could be standardized. Officials could collect revenue without needing to constantly evaluate the reliability of different currencies. But beyond these practical benefits, minting coins carried deeper significance. A coin was a declaration of authority. By placing the ruler's name on silver or gold, a state proclaimed its sovereignty to the world. Every coin struck in a mint carried that message outward. It traveled through markets, villages, and caravan routes. It passed from merchant to merchant, from farmer to soldier. Each exchange quietly repeated the same statement. This land is governed by this ruler. For a rising frontier principality, such a statement carried weight. It marked a transition from local power to recognized authority. The decision to mint coins therefore required confidence. A ruler had to believe that his position was strong enough to support such a declaration. Issuing coinage too early could attract attention from stronger powers who might view the act as a challenge. But waiting too long could delay the development of institutions that strengthened the state. For the Ottomans in the early 14th century, the balance was beginning to shift. Their power in northwestern Anatolia had grown steadily. The capture of important towns had increased their economic resources. Their leadership was gaining experience in governance as well as warfare. These developments created the conditions necessary for a new step: the establishment of a mint. Such a decision did not occur in isolation. Minting coins required skilled craftsmen capable of engraving dies and striking metal blanks with precision. Precious metals had to be acquired, either through mining, trade, or the melting down of existing currency. Officials needed to supervise the process to ensure consistency in weight and quality. In many ways, a mint represented an early form of state institution. It required organization, oversight, and a level of administrative capability that reflected a more developed political structure. When the Ottomans eventually took this step, they joined a long tradition shared by rulers across the Islamic world. For centuries, Islamic coinage had followed certain conventions. Coins typically bore inscriptions rather than portraits. These inscriptions often included the name of the ruler, along with religious phrases acknowledging divine authority. Such designs linked political power with the broader framework of Islamic legitimacy. They reminded those who used the coins that earthly authority operated within a divine order. For the Ottoman rulers, adopting this tradition helped position their state within the wider Islamic political world. Their coins would not only serve economic purposes, they would also communicate identity. They would signal that the Ottoman Principality had begun to claim a place among the recognized powers of the region. And so the moment arrived. In workshops where metalworkers carefully prepared silver blanks, the tools of coin production were assembled. Engravers carved inscriptions into metal dies. Each letter had to be precise, each line carefully balanced. These dies would shape the appearance of every coin struck from them. When the hammer finally fell against the die and the first coin was created, the sound must have been unremarkable. Just metal striking metal. Yet that simple act carried meaning. Because in that moment, the Ottoman ruler's name was transformed into currency, into something that would travel through markets and settlements across the land, into something that would carry his authority from hand to hand. The Ottomans had taken a step that many rising states before them had taken. They had begun to mint their own coins. And with that step, the frontier principality moved a little closer to becoming a state whose authority reached beyond the battlefield. A state whose power could now be measured not only in territory and soldiers, but in silver. Once the decision had been made, the creation of a mint required more than a declaration of authority. It required a place where that authority could take physical form. In the medieval world, a mint was both a workshop and an institution. It was the place where precious metal, usually silver, sometimes gold or copper, was transformed into currency that could circulate throughout the economy. But a mint was not simply a room filled with tools. It was part of the machinery of the state. Establishing one meant organizing craftsmen, securing supplies of metal, regulating production, and ensuring that every coin produced met the standards expected by merchants and officials. For the Ottomans, this represented an important step in their development. Their state had grown strong enough to support such an institution. Their rulers now controlled territory that included towns, markets, and trade routes where a new currency could circulate. The mint itself would likely have been located in one of the more important urban centers under Ottoman control. Cities offered the resources necessary for coin production. Skilled metalworkers could be found there, along with administrators who could oversee the process and ensure that the state maintained control over the precious metals used in coinage. Urban centers also served as the main hubs of economic activity. Coins produced in the mint would quickly find their way into local markets, where merchants and traders would begin using them in everyday transactions. Inside the mint, the work of producing coins followed a series of careful steps. First, the metal itself had to be prepared. Silver might arrive in different forms: bars, fragments of older coins, or pieces of raw metal obtained through trade. Before it could be used, the metal had to be melted and refined to achieve the proper level of purity. Once prepared, the molten silver was poured into molds and shaped into thin sheets or bars. From these sheets, workers cut small circular pieces known as blanks. Each blank represented a future coin, though at this stage it was simply a small disc of metal without markings. The next step required the work of highly skilled engravers. Using sharp tools and remarkable precision, these craftsmen carved the design of the coin into hardened metal dies. Each die contained the inscriptions and patterns that would appear on the finished coin. Unlike the coins of many earlier empires, Islamic coinage typically did not display portraits. Instead, the designs relied on inscriptions written in elegant Arabic script. These inscriptions often included the name of the ruler, along with religious phrases invoking the authority of God. Sometimes they also included the place where the coin was minted or the year of its production. For the Ottoman rulers, these inscriptions served multiple purposes. They connected the new state to the broader traditions of Islamic governance. They proclaimed the identity of the ruler responsible for the coin's creation. And they reinforced the idea that political authority operated within a divine framework. Once the dies were prepared, the final stage of coin production could begin. A metal blank was placed between two dies, one for the front of the coin and one for the back. The lower die rested firmly on a solid surface, while the upper die was positioned carefully above the blank. Then a hammer struck the upper die with force. The impact pressed the engraved design into the metal, leaving a clear impression on both sides of the coin. Each strike of the hammer produced a single coin. The process was simple in principle, yet it required careful skill. Too little force would leave the design incomplete. Too much could damage the die or distort the coin. Workers repeated this process again and again, producing coins one at a time. Over hours and days, the small pile of finished coins grew. Each one carried the same message: the name of the ruler, the symbols of authority, the weight and metal content that defined its value. When these coins left the mint, they entered the world beyond its walls. Some went directly to officials responsible for collecting taxes. Others were used to pay soldiers and administrators serving the state. Many found their way into local markets, where merchants began accepting them in exchange for goods. At first, the appearance of a new coin might have attracted curiosity. Traders would examine its weight and metal content. Money changers would test its reliability. Merchants would compare it with other coins circulating in the region. If the new currency proved trustworthy, consistent in weight and quality, it would gradually gain acceptance. And once merchants trusted it, the coin would begin its journey through the economic life of the territory. From market to market, from town to village, from one hand to another. In this way, the mint served not only as a place of production, but as a center from which authority spread outward. Every coin struck within its walls carried the ruler's name into the daily life of the population. Each transaction reinforced the presence of the state. Over time, the use of Ottoman coinage would help integrate the markets of the region into a shared economic system. Taxes, wages, and trade would increasingly rely on currency issued by the Ottoman ruler. What began as a practical solution to the needs of commerce became something larger. It became a symbol of the state itself, a quiet reminder that authority now existed not only on the battlefield or within the walls of a fortress, but also within the simple exchange of goods in a marketplace. In the steady rhythm of hammer striking metal, the Ottoman state was engraving its presence into silver. And with every coin that left the mint, that presence traveled further across the land. For historians studying the early Ottoman state, the first coins struck by the Ottomans are more than pieces of silver. They are some of the earliest physical evidence that reveal how the young principality began to present itself as a sovereign power. Unlike written chronicles, which were often composed decades later and shaped by memory or political narrative, coins are direct artifacts of their time. They were created in the moment of authority they represent. And among the earliest known Ottoman coins, many are associated with the reign of Orhan, the son of Osman. By the time Orhan came to power in the early 14th century, the Ottoman Principality had already undergone important changes. The small frontier domain that Osman had ruled was expanding. Towns and fortified settlements had come under Ottoman control, and the political structure of the state was becoming more organized. One of the most important developments of this period was the capture of Bursa. After years of pressure on the Byzantine frontier, the city finally fell under Ottoman control in 1326. Bursa was not just another town. It was a significant urban center with thriving markets, established trade routes, and a population accustomed to urban administration. When Orhan made Bursa the capital of the Ottoman state, the character of the principality changed in subtle but important ways. A ruler governing from a major city required institutions capable of managing a more complex society. Administration became more formalized. Trade became more structured, and the economic life of the region expanded. Within this environment, the production of Ottoman coinage began to take shape. The earliest known Ottoman coins are small silver pieces often referred to as akçe, though the development of the currency would continue to evolve over time. These coins were modest in size but rich in meaning. Unlike the coins of many earlier empires that displayed portraits of rulers, early Ottoman coins followed the traditions of Islamic coinage. Their surfaces were filled with carefully engraved inscriptions rather than images. Arabic script formed the central design. At the heart of these inscriptions appeared the name of the ruler, Orhan, often accompanied by titles acknowledging his authority. Alongside the ruler's name were phrases that reflected the religious and political culture of the Islamic world. Invocations of divine authority reminded those who handled the coins that earthly power operated within a broader spiritual framework. The inscriptions were simple, yet deliberate. They communicated identity, legitimacy, and continuity with the traditions of earlier Islamic states. To modern observers, these coins may appear understated compared to the elaborate currency of later centuries. Their surfaces lack the detailed portraits or decorative imagery that many people associate with medieval coinage. But their simplicity reflects a deliberate cultural choice. In Islamic tradition, inscriptions carried meaning through words rather than images. The written name of the ruler served as the central symbol of authority. Every coin produced in the Ottoman mint carried that name outward into the world. When merchants handled the coins in markets, they encountered the inscription. When officials collected taxes, they received currency bearing the ruler's name. When soldiers received payment for their service, the coins they held reminded them of the authority they served. Through these repeated exchanges, the name engraved in silver became familiar throughout the territory. The coin itself became a quiet messenger. Its journey began in the mint, where craftsmen struck the inscription into metal. But once released into circulation, the coin traveled freely. It passed through markets, villages, and caravan routes. It might be carried by a merchant traveling between towns, or used by a farmer purchasing tools or livestock. Each transaction carried the coin further across the land. And with every exchange, the ruler's authority moved with it. For a young state still establishing its identity, this circulation mattered greatly. The appearance of Ottoman coinage signaled that the principality had reached a new stage of development. It showed that the state possessed not only military strength, but also the administrative capacity to regulate its own currency. It demonstrated confidence in the ruler's sovereignty. Minting coins required resources and organization, but it also required legitimacy. A ruler whose authority was uncertain would hesitate to place his name on currency, because coins traveled beyond the borders of his territory. They would eventually reach the markets of neighboring states. They would be examined by merchants and officials outside his domain. In this way, coinage served as a public declaration. When the Ottomans began striking coins bearing the name of their ruler, they were announcing their presence to the wider political world. They were declaring that their authority had become stable enough to support a currency of its own. For historians today, these early coins provide valuable insight into the transformation of the Ottoman state. They reveal how a frontier principality began, adopting the institutions that defined sovereign rule. They show how political authority was expressed not only through conquest, but through administration and economic organization. And they remind us that the rise of a great empire did not occur through dramatic events alone. Sometimes it unfolded through quieter developments, through decisions made in workshops and markets rather than battlefields, through the steady circulation of small pieces of silver that carried a ruler's name across the land. The first Ottoman coins may have been modest in appearance, but in their quiet way, they marked a turning point, a moment when the authority of a frontier ruler was no longer confined to the walls of his cities or the strength of his armies. It had been struck into silver and sent out into the world. When someone in the 14th century picked up an Ottoman coin, what they saw was not an image. There was no portrait of the ruler, no crown, no symbol of a throne. Instead, they saw words, lines of Arabic script arranged carefully across the surface of the metal. To modern eyes, these inscriptions can appear abstract, almost decorative, but to the people who used the coins, the words carried clear meaning. They announced the authority behind the coin. They declared the identity of the ruler, and they linked political power with religious legitimacy. This style of coinage reflected a long tradition within the Islamic world. Unlike many earlier empires, Islamic states generally avoided placing portraits of rulers on their currency. Instead, coins communicated authority through text. The written word held powerful symbolic meaning. It connected political power to language, faith, and law. On early Ottoman coins, the most important element was the name of the ruler. The name was often accompanied by titles acknowledging his authority, and sometimes by phrases invoking divine blessing. Through these inscriptions, the coin communicated a simple but powerful message. This currency exists under the authority of this ruler. To the merchants and traders who handled the coin, the inscription served as a form of authentication. It told them who stood behind the currency. In the medieval economy, that mattered greatly. Coins were valuable not only because of the metal they contained, but because of the trust people placed in them. A coin minted by a respected authority was more likely to be accepted in markets far from its place of origin. Merchants trusted that the issuing ruler had maintained consistent standards of weight and purity. If a coin proved reliable over time, its reputation spread through trade networks. Soon it might be accepted across entire regions. This is how successful currencies gained influence. Not through proclamation alone, but through the steady confidence of those who used them. For the Ottomans, this trust had to be earned. Their coins were new. Merchants encountering them for the first time would examine them carefully. They would weigh them, study the inscriptions, compare them with other coins already circulating in the market. Money changers, those specialists who evaluated currency, would test the metal and assess its reliability. If the coin met expectations, it would gradually enter regular circulation. If it failed, traders might reject it or demand additional payment to compensate for uncertainty. In the early years of Ottoman coinage, this process of acceptance likely unfolded slowly. Markets were cautious, but consistency mattered. If each coin carried the same weight and reliable silver content, confidence would grow. Over time, merchants would begin accepting Ottoman coins without hesitation. As that happened, the ruler's name engraved in silver would spread naturally through economic life. Every time someone paid for grain in the market, the coin passed along its message. Every time a tax collector received payment, the inscription repeated the authority behind the transaction. Every time a soldier received his wages, the coin in his hand reminded him whose power sustained the state. Through these everyday exchanges, the words engraved on the coin became familiar. They connected the abstract idea of political authority with the practical realities of daily life. For most people living in the Ottoman territories, the coin was one of the few physical objects that carried the name of the ruler directly into their hands. They might never see the ruler himself. They might never travel to the capital city where decisions were made. But through currency, they encountered his authority regularly. This is one of the reasons coinage played such an important role in medieval governance. It brought the presence of the state into the most ordinary moments of life. Buying bread, selling livestock, paying taxes, receiving wages. Each of these acts relied on money, and each coin silently carried the identity of the power that produced it. For the Ottoman state, still young and developing, this circulation helped reinforce legitimacy. The more widely their coins were used, the more familiar their authority became. Markets adapted. Merchants grew accustomed to the new currency. Gradually, the Ottoman monetary system began integrating itself into the broader economy of the region. Coins that had once been examined with curiosity were now accepted with routine confidence. What had begun as an experiment in sovereignty became a normal part of everyday trade. And the words engraved in silver continued to travel, quietly but persistently, across towns, villages, and caravan routes. Through these inscriptions, the Ottoman state spoke, not with speeches or proclamations, but with currency. Not in grand declarations, but in the quiet repetition of trade. A ruler's name struck into metal, carried from hand to hand, until it became part of the economic rhythm of the land. Once the first Ottoman coins began circulating through markets and towns, their influence extended far beyond the walls of the mint. Each coin became a traveler. It moved constantly, from merchant to merchant, from town to village, from tax collector to farmer, from soldier to craftsman. In a world where communication was slow and literacy was limited, these small pieces of silver carried messages in a remarkably effective way. They spread the name of the ruler, quietly, consistently, and everywhere. In medieval societies, authority was not always visible to the people who lived under it. Most subjects would never see the ruler whose name governed their lives. The capital city might lie far away, and political decisions were often made in places ordinary people would never visit. But coins bridged that distance. They brought the ruler's presence directly into everyday life. A merchant counting his earnings at the end of the day might notice the inscription on the coin. A farmer selling grain in the market would accept payment bearing the ruler's name. A soldier receiving wages from a local official would hold the same currency in his hands. Each exchange reinforced a simple idea. This land is governed by this authority. Over time, that message became familiar. For the Ottoman state, still expanding and consolidating its power, this familiarity mattered greatly. Political authority is not sustained by force alone. It also depends on recognition, on the acceptance, both conscious and unconscious, that a particular ruler's authority defines the political order of the region. Coinage helped establish that recognition. When a coin circulated widely, the ruler's name engraved upon it became part of the rhythm of economic life. Markets repeated it. Taxes repeated it. Wages repeated it. Through these countless small interactions, the authority of the state embedded itself into the daily experiences of its population. In many ways, coins functioned as one of the most effective forms of political communication available in the medieval world. Unlike written proclamations, which might reach only a limited audience, coins traveled freely. Unlike messengers, who delivered information once and moved on, coins remained in circulation for years, sometimes for decades. Each time they changed hands, they repeated the same message. And the reach of this message extended beyond the boundaries of the Ottoman territories. Merchants traveling between cities carried coins with them. A trader leaving an Ottoman market might journey to another region where the currency was less familiar. There, money changers and merchants would examine the coin carefully. They would weigh it, study its inscription, evaluate the quality of the metal. If the coin proved reliable, it might be accepted in trade even outside the lands of its origin. In this way, the presence of Ottoman coinage slowly extended into neighboring regions. Not through conquest but through commerce. The appearance of these coins in foreign markets carried its own significance. Rival rulers and officials would eventually encounter them as well. A new currency bearing the name of a rising power was difficult to ignore. It signaled that the issuing ruler possessed both the resources and the confidence to produce coinage. In the political language of the medieval world, that was a meaningful statement. Minting coins placed a ruler among the recognized authorities of the region. It suggested that his rule was stable enough to support institutions beyond the battlefield. For the Ottomans, whose early rise had taken place along contested frontier lands, this development marked an important stage. Their state was no longer defined solely by raids and expansion. It was beginning to express itself through institutions, through systems that organized society and reinforced authority in everyday life. The mint was one of those institutions. The coins it produced became tools through which the state communicated its presence. At the same time, the use of Ottoman coinage helped unify the economic life of the territory. Markets within the principality increasingly shared a common currency. Taxation became more standardized. Officials could collect revenue with greater efficiency. Soldiers and administrators could be paid with coins issued directly by the state they served. This integration strengthened the internal cohesion of the Ottoman domain. Economic life, administrative structures, and political authority became more closely connected. Over time, the circulation of Ottoman currency would expand dramatically. As the state grew into a regional power and eventually into an empire, its coinage would travel across vast territories. From the Balkans to the Middle East, from North Africa to the Black Sea. But in the early 14th century, that future still lay far ahead. The first Ottoman coins circulated through a much smaller world. A frontier landscape of towns, villages, and trade routes, where a new political power was slowly establishing its identity. Yet even in this early stage, the coins carried a quiet significance. They were not merely tools of commerce. They were messengers, small pieces of silver that carried the name of the ruler across the land. And with each exchange, they repeated the same simple message. The Ottoman state had arrived, and its authority now moved through the markets of Anatolia. As Ottoman coins began circulating through the markets of their territory, they gradually became part of a larger transformation taking place within the young state. The Ottoman Principality was expanding. New towns were coming under its control. Trade routes that once lay beyond its influence were now passing through lands governed by Ottoman authorities. Farmers cultivated fields that contributed taxes to the state, while merchants and craftsmen participated in markets that connected the region to wider economic networks. With each passing year, the economy of the principality grew more complex. And as that complexity increased, the importance of a stable monetary system became more apparent. In earlier decades, the use of foreign coinage had been a practical necessity. The Ottomans had inherited a frontier economy shaped by centuries of Byzantine and Seljuk influence. Coins from these older states continued to circulate long after their political authority had weakened. But now the Ottomans were no longer simply inheriting economic systems created by others. They were building their own. A currency issued by the Ottoman state offered several advantages. First, it simplified trade within the territory. Merchants no longer had to rely entirely on unfamiliar coins whose value might be questioned in different markets. A coin minted under the authority of the local ruler could be accepted more confidently within his domain. As Ottoman coins became more familiar, they began to form a common foundation for everyday transactions. Farmers selling grain in village markets accepted them. Craftsmen receiving payment for their work accepted them. Merchants buying goods for regional trade accepted them. This shared currency helped connect different parts of the principality into a single economic system. Markets that once operated with a confusing mixture of coins gradually adapted to the presence of a local currency. Over time, this consistency made commerce easier and more efficient. The second advantage involved taxation. In medieval states, tax collection could be complicated when payments arrived in multiple forms of currency. Officials needed to evaluate the value of different coins and sometimes convert them into standardized units before revenue could be properly accounted for. With a local currency circulating widely, this process became more straightforward. Taxes could increasingly be paid in Ottoman coinage. The state could collect revenue in a form of money whose value it regulated. This strengthened the connection between the economy and the institutions of governance. The third advantage concerned the payment of soldiers and officials. Military forces played a central role in the expansion of the Ottoman state. Warriors who fought in campaigns expected rewards for their service, whether in the form of land grants or financial compensation. A stable currency made these payments easier to organize. Officials could distribute wages in coins produced by the state itself. This created a direct link between the authority of the ruler and the economic livelihood of those who served him. The presence of Ottoman coinage therefore helped reinforce the administrative structure of the principality. It allowed the state to manage resources more effectively and to integrate economic activity into its system of governance. But the influence of the new currency extended beyond administrative convenience. Coins also shaped the everyday experiences of the people living within the Ottoman territories. For merchants and traders, reliable currency reduced uncertainty in commercial exchanges. A coin that maintained consistent weight and metal content could be trusted in transactions. Over time, this trust encouraged merchants to conduct more business within Ottoman markets. Trade routes passing through the region benefited from the stability that such currency provided. Caravans traveling between cities could accept Ottoman coins without hesitation. Goods flowed more easily between communities connected by a shared monetary system. This economic integration supported the continued growth of the state. As commerce expanded, markets grew more active. As markets grew, tax revenues increased. And as revenues increased, the Ottoman leadership gained the resources necessary to strengthen their administration and military forces. In this way, the mint became more than a place where coins were produced. It became part of a larger cycle that supported the development of the state. Silver was transformed into currency. Currency circulated through markets. Markets generated economic activity, and that activity sustained the institutions of governance. The early Ottoman rulers may not have imagined the full scale of the empire that would one day emerge from their frontier principality. But they understood the importance of building structures that allowed their territory to function effectively. Coinage was one of those structures. It helped transform scattered settlements into an integrated economic landscape. It supported trade, taxation, and administration, and it strengthened the authority of the state in ways that reached far beyond the battlefield. Through the steady circulation of coins, the Ottoman Principality was laying the foundations of a more organized and resilient political order. A small step in the workshop of the mint had become part of a much larger transformation, one that would shape the future of the region for centuries to come. By the time Ottoman coins had begun circulating widely through their territories, the act of minting currency had already achieved something important. It had transformed the nature of Ottoman authority. In the early days of the Principality, power had rested primarily on military success. Frontier leaders gained influence through victories, alliances, and the loyalty of their followers. Territory expanded through raids and the capture of settlements, and leadership often depended on personal reputation and strength. But such power could be fragile. Many frontier states throughout history had risen quickly only to disappear just as rapidly when their leaders lost influence or when stronger neighbors intervened. For a state to endure, power needed to move beyond the battlefield. It needed to be supported by institutions, systems that allowed authority to function even when armies were not campaigning, systems that organized land, taxation, justice, and economic life. The mint was one of the institutions that signaled this transformation. By striking coins bearing the ruler's name, the Ottoman state demonstrated that its authority had taken a more permanent form. It was no longer simply the power of a successful frontier commander. It had begun to resemble the sovereignty of a recognized political state. Throughout the medieval Islamic world, sovereignty was often symbolized through two key acts. The first was the public prayer delivered in the ruler's name during the Friday sermon. The second was the minting of coins bearing that ruler's inscription. When these acts took place within a territory, they signaled that the ruler's authority had been established in that region. They transformed military control into recognized governance. For the Ottomans, minting coins placed them within this long-standing political tradition. Their state was no longer operating only as a frontier force, expanding along unstable borders. It was beginning to present itself as a legitimate authority among the powers of the region. This message was not lost on neighboring states. Coins circulated widely through trade networks. Merchants traveling between cities carried currency with them. Over time, Ottoman coins would inevitably appear in markets beyond the immediate borders of the principality. Money changers and traders encountering these coins would study them carefully. They would recognize the inscriptions. They would identify the ruler whose name appeared on the silver, and they would understand what that meant. A new authority had begun to assert itself in the region. In the language of medieval politics, minting coins was a declaration. It did not need to be announced through speeches or proclamations. The coins themselves carried the message. They revealed that the Ottoman ruler possessed both the resources and the confidence to place his name into circulation. They showed that his authority was strong enough to support institutions capable of regulating currency. In this sense, coinage functioned as both economic tool and political statement. It helped markets operate more efficiently, but it also communicated legitimacy. For the Ottoman state, this legitimacy was especially important during its early decades. The principality existed in a region where many competing powers sought influence. Other Turkish beyliks ruled neighboring territories. The Byzantine Empire still controlled important cities and fortresses. The legacy of Mongol authority continued to shape political relationships across Anatolia. Within this environment, establishing recognized sovereignty required careful balance. Military expansion demonstrated strength. but institutions demonstrated permanence. The mint represented one of the clearest signs that the Ottoman leadership intended to rule not only through conquest, but through governance. And as their coins circulated more widely, that intention became visible to both subjects and rivals. Each coin repeated the same message. This ruler governs here. This authority shapes the markets and towns of this land. This state possesses the institutions of sovereignty. Over time, these signals helped reinforce the Ottoman position in the political landscape of Anatolia. The principality that had once been one among many frontier powers was gradually distinguishing itself. Its institutions were becoming more organized, its economic systems more stable, its authority more recognizable. Coins played a quiet role in that transformation. They did not conquer cities. They did not lead armies. But they carried the identity of the state into every marketplace and settlement where they circulated. And with every exchange, they reminded people of the authority that had produced them. The Ottoman state was beginning to define itself not only by the lands it controlled, but by the institutions that sustained its rule. Among those institutions, the mint stood as one of the clearest symbols that the frontier principality had begun to claim the status of a sovereign state. Once Ottoman coins had entered circulation, their influence did not remain confined to the towns where they were first used. Money by its nature travels. Every transaction moves it forward, carrying it from one person to another, from one market to the next. And as Ottoman coins passed through the hands of merchants, craftsmen, farmers, and officials, they began to spread gradually across the landscape of northwestern Anatolia. At first, their presence was strongest in the towns and villages directly governed by Ottoman authority. Markets within these territories quickly became accustomed to the new currency. Merchants learned its weight. Money changers recognized its silver content. Traders began accepting it with increasing confidence. The coin was no longer unfamiliar. It had become part of the everyday rhythm of commerce. But trade rarely remained within the borders of a single state. Caravans moved between cities across the region, connecting communities through long-established commercial networks. Merchants often traveled great distances, carrying goods from one market to another. When these traders left Ottoman territory, they carried Ottoman coins with them. In nearby regions, the appearance of these coins might have drawn attention. Money changers and merchants encountering them for the first time would inspect the silver carefully. They would study the inscriptions and weigh the coin to determine its value. If the currency proved reliable, it would slowly gain acceptance beyond the lands where it had first been minted. This process was gradual. Currencies did not spread through political decree alone, they spread through trust. Merchants who found a coin dependable in trade would accept it again in future transactions. Over time, that confidence allowed the currency to circulate more widely. In this way, Ottoman coinage began to move through the commercial networks of the region. A merchant traveling from Bursa to another Anatolian town might carry Ottoman coins as part of his trading capital. Another trader might accept them in exchange for textiles or livestock, then carry them onward to yet another market. Each exchange extended the reach of the currency, and with it, the reach of the Ottoman ruler's name. The spread of coinage therefore mirrored the expanding influence of the Ottoman state itself. As the principality grew stronger and its territories expanded, more markets fell within its sphere of economic activity. Cities and towns connected by trade began using Ottoman coins with greater frequency. Tax systems within the state increasingly relied on the new currency. Officials collected revenue in coins produced by the mint. Soldiers received wages in the same silver currency that circulated through markets. This growing circulation created a shared economic framework across the Ottoman lands. People living in different towns, sometimes separated by considerable distance, could participate in trade using the same money. Such consistency strengthened the internal connections of the state. Markets became more integrated. Economic activity flowed more easily across regional boundaries. For the Ottoman leadership, this integration carried strategic advantages. A unified economic system supported the administration of the territory. It allowed resources to move more efficiently between regions. It strengthened the relationship between local communities and the central authority of the state. But perhaps just as important was the symbolic impact of the currency's spread. Every coin carried the ruler's name. As the coins traveled, that name traveled with them. Merchants in distant markets encountered the inscription. Money changers studied it. Officials in neighboring states might even come across the currency as it appeared in regional trade. Through these quiet movements, the Ottoman state was gradually making itself known. Not through dramatic announcements or declarations, but through the ordinary flow of commerce. A coin exchanged for grain in a village market. A handful of silver used to purchase cloth in a town. A payment made to a craftsman for his work. Each of these small moments carried the same message. The authority behind this currency exists. It governs land. It regulates markets. It participates in the economic life of the region. In time, the Ottoman state would expand far beyond its early frontier territory. Its currency would eventually circulate across vast areas stretching from southeastern Europe to the Middle East and North Africa. But in these early decades, the spread of Ottoman coinage was still modest. It moved through a smaller network of towns and trade routes. Yet even in this limited space, the impact was meaningful, because each coin helped reinforce the presence of a rising power, a power that had begun as a frontier principality, but was steadily building the institutions of a lasting state. And with every journey from hand to hand, the silver coins of the Ottoman mint carried that transformation quietly across the land. When historians look back at the rise of the Ottoman Empire, their attention is often drawn to dramatic events. Great battles, major conquests, the capture of powerful cities. These moments stand out in the historical record because they are sudden and visible. They reshape maps and shift the balance of power in ways that are easy to recognize. But the growth of a state rarely depends on dramatic moments alone. Behind every conquest lies a quieter process, a gradual development of institutions that allow power to endure long after the battles are over. The establishment of the first Ottoman mint was part of that quieter process. At the time, the creation of a mint may not have seemed extraordinary. Metalworkers struck coins as they had done in many states before. Merchants began using the new currency in markets, and officials incorporated it into systems of taxation and payment. From one day to the next, life in the Ottoman territories likely appeared much the same. Yet the significance of the mint lay not in the immediate changes it produced, but in what it represented. It represented a shift in the nature of Ottoman authority. The early leaders of the principality had built their power through frontier warfare. Their influence spread through military campaigns, alliances, and the loyalty of followers drawn to opportunity on the borderlands. But military success alone could not sustain a state indefinitely. Territory gained through conquest required administration. Communities required systems of justice and governance. Markets required stability and reliable currency. Institutions were necessary to support the growing complexity of society. The mint was one of those institutions. By producing coins bearing the ruler's name, the Ottoman state embedded its authority into the everyday life of its territory. Every time someone used an Ottoman coin in a transaction, they participated in the economic system created by the state. Every time taxes were paid in that currency, the relationship between ruler and subject was reinforced. Every time soldiers received wages struck from the mint, the connection between military service and political authority became tangible. Through these repeated interactions, the structures of the state gradually strengthened. The mint helped link the battlefield with the marketplace. It connected political authority with economic life. And it helped transform a frontier principality into a more organized and enduring political order. For the Ottomans, this transformation unfolded slowly. The early 14th century still belonged to a world of uncertainty and competition. Neighboring states continued to challenge Ottoman expansion, and the principality remained one among many powers in Anatolia. Yet the institutions created during this period laid foundations that would support future growth. As the Ottoman state expanded into new territories, the systems developed in these early decades would travel with it. Administrative structures would evolve. Markets would grow larger and more interconnected. And Ottoman coinage would circulate across increasingly vast regions. What had begun as a modest silver currency used in frontier towns would eventually become the monetary system of an empire spanning continents. The coins themselves would change over time. Designs would evolve. Mints would appear in new cities as the empire expanded. But the principle established in those early years remained the same. A ruler's authority expressed through currency. A state whose power could be recognized not only in fortresses and armies, but also in the simple exchange of goods. Today, the surviving coins of the early Ottoman period appear small and unremarkable. They are simple pieces of silver, often worn by centuries of circulation. Yet within those coins lies the story of a transformation. The story of how a frontier community began to develop the institutions of a state. How a rising power expressed its authority through symbols recognized across the medieval world. And how something as ordinary as money could carry the identity of a ruler across an entire society. Empires are often remembered through their greatest victories, but sometimes their foundations are struck quietly, in silver, one coin at a time. If you'd like to keep exploring history's biggest questions, you're welcome to subscribe and continue this journey. And if there's a moment from the past you think deserves a deeper look, feel free to share it in the comments.